In all natural languages, meanings are expressed by putting words together into grammatical units or phrases. For the purposes of this video, we're going to focus on three basic types of phrases. Possessive phrases like the woman's dog, where one noun possesses another. Adpositional phrases like in the house, where a noun serves as a referent for an adposition. And verb phrases like I see the dog, where the action of the verb is received by an object. Each of these phrases contains what's called a head, which is kind of difficult to define without going into complex theoretical stuff. But to put it simply, the head is essentially the word that defines what type of phrase is occurring and that must be present for the phrase to exist, while the other word in the phrase is called the dependent, which just serves to modify the head and can't occur without a head to refer to. For example, in a possessive phrase like the woman's dog, the fact that the dog belongs to the woman is just an optional bit of extra information, and omitting it would just leave the dog, which is still a grammatically valid thing to say, whereas the woman's can't stand on its own without some other noun to possess. So in possessive phrases, the thing that's being possessed, sometimes called the possessum or possessee, is the head, while its possessor is the dependent. In adpositional phrases, the head is the adposition, since, by definition, it's not an adpositional phrase if there's no adposition, and the dependent is therefore the object or the referent of the adposition. Finally, in the verb phrase, the head is the verb and the dependent is the direct object, and depending on exactly what definition you're using, the subject may or may not also be considered a dependent, but we'll focus just on the direct object for clarity. Heads and dependents are usually brought up in the context of head initial and head final syntax, which describes how languages have a tendency to keep the order of the head and the dependent consistent across all types of phrases, but the way a language treats its heads and dependents will also surface in its morphology. When putting phrases together, most languages will include some sort of marking to specify what type of phrase is occurring and the role of each of the constituents within the phrase. This marking will most often occur as an affix on either the head or the dependent, giving rise to two possible systems of marking. Let's go through some examples of each of these phrases and contrast how they're handled between dependent marking and head marking systems. Starting off with a possessive phrase like the woman's dog, in a dependent marking language we take the possessor, in this case the woman, and attach an affix that marks it as the possessor of the other noun in the phrase. You'll notice that not only is this exactly what English does with its apostrophe s suffix, but also, by definition, that's exactly what a genitive case marker does. So languages like Latin, Greek, and Russian can all be said to be dependent marking in possessive phrases. Meanwhile, in a head marking language, we take the possessed noun, in this case the dog, and attach an affix that marks it as being possessed by the other noun. This may occur as just a single marker, like the construct state in many of the Semitic languages, but it's also very common for this marking to agree with the possessor in person, number, and possibly gender if the language has it. So in a language like classical Nahuatl, to say my dog, one would simply take the word chichi, dog, and apply a first-person possessive marker to get no chichi, whereas your dog would be mochichi, his, her, or its dog would be ichichi, and to say the woman's dog, you would say ichichisiwatl, which would literally be her dog the woman. Next up, in an adpositional phrase like in the house, we'd expect a dependent marking language to take the house and mark it as being the object of the adposition. Specifically, the way this is usually done is that the adposition will assign a particular case to its object, which will vary from language to language and may also depend on which adposition is being used and what the intended meaning is. For instance, to say in the house in Latin, the preposition in assigns the ablative case, but to say into the house, the same preposition now applies the accusative case, whereas toward the house still assigns the accusative but instead uses a different preposition. Meanwhile, in a head marking language, we would expect the adposition to be marked as the head of the phrase, which once again will usually agree with the object in person, number, and possibly gender. So in Nahuatl, to say in the house, you would say itikkalli, literally inside it the house. By the way, it's very common for the morphology taken by these inflecting adpositions to be identical to those taken by the head in possessive phrases, for the simple reason that adpositional phrases commonly evolve from possessive ones. Finally, for verb phrases, a dependent marking language will usually take the direct object and mark it as being the dependent of the verb phrase, which, again, by definition, is what an accusative case marker does. So, in case you hadn't already figured it out, the plot twist is that dependent marking is functionally identical to case marking, so the vast majority of languages that use case markers can be described as dependent marking. On the other hand, head marking languages will take the head, the verb, and apply a marker that signifies that the verb has a direct object, which, once again, will usually agree with the object in person, number, and potentially gender. Also, on a related note, if the verb is going to inflect to agree with the object, then it will almost certainly agree with the subject as well, a feature called polypersonal agreement. So in nahuatl, to say, I see the dog, you would say, Nikita chichi, literally, I see it, the dog. So these are the two prototypical strategies for dependent marking and head marking. Just like head initial versus head final syntax, most languages will show a strong preference for one over the other, partly because of the way these systems come about. Cases routinely evolve from adpositions that affix onto their accompanying nouns, while head marking strategies typically evolve from pronouns that fuse onto the words they occur with. So usually only one of these two developments will take place, but occasionally more mixed systems can occur as well. Swahili makes ample use of polypersonal agreement in its verb system, like a head marking language, but also handles possession by way of genitive pronouns, like a dependent marking language. While Hungarian has a rich case inventory to mark most roles, except in possessive phrases where it instead marks the possessed noun with an affix that agrees with its possessor, like a head marking language. In rare cases, phrases can even be double marked. In possessive phrases, Turkish marks the possessor with a genitive case, but simultaneously marks the possessed noun with a possessive suffix, so literally, of the woman, her dog. And a few languages, like Basque and Georgian, show double marking in the verb phrase by using both case marking and polypersonal agreement. This kind of double marking is quite rare, since it's a little bit redundant to mark the roles in the phrase twice, but it does happen occasionally. It's also possible for phrases to not show any overt marking, leaving the interpretation entirely up to word order or just context. Adpositional phrases frequently have no morphology at all, just a noun and an adposition next to each other, which is often all that's needed to understand the intended meaning. Sometimes zero marking can also occur in possessive phrases, where the roles aren't clarified with any specific morphology, but are instead inferred just by putting the two nouns in juxtaposition. And in many isolational languages, word order alone will be enough to clarify which noun is the subject and which is the object without the need for case marking or verb agreement. Whether a language is head marking or dependent marking will go a long way to determine many aspects of its grammar, so when making a conlang, it's worth bearing in mind from the very beginning. Specifically, decide, ideally as early as possible, whether you want your language to favour head marking or dependent marking, but also decide if you want to stick to the prototypical marking systems or include any exceptions, such as choosing a specific type of phrase that marks in the opposite way to other phrases, or that takes no marking or even double marking. Whatever you decide, create dependent marking strategies by having adpositions affix onto the nouns they occur with to become case markers, and head marking strategies by having pronouns affix onto heads. And finally, keep your marking system in mind when deriving new constructions to keep your grammar consistent.